consuming 20% of the body's energy. The human brain is the single most complex thing in the known universe. Formed out of 100 billion neurons, what makes you you, or at least what makes you think you're you, is stored inside this pinkish structure. So let's investigate the science behind your most expensive organ. The brain. The brain is the organ that commands the entire body, and it is responsible for everything, from feelings to navigation, to breathing to sleeping. Nerves primarily make up the brain, which in turn are bundles of neurons. Different parts of the brain correspond to different functions. We've linked more information about the different parts of the brain in the bibliography below. In general, the brain is composed of two different materials, white and gray matter. White matter, which makes up the insides of the brain, mainly serves to send and receive signals. It is composed of the axons of neurons, the thin thread-like structures that carry electrical signals away. Meanwhile, gray matter, which makes up the outsides of the brain, processes information. It is made up of the cell bodies of the neuron, known as the soma. The nervous system. The brain, like all other organs in the human body, is a part of a larger collaboration between organs called an organ system. The organ system the brain is a member of is the nervous system. The nervous system contains the brain, the spinal cord, and the other nerves scattered throughout the body. In general, the nervous system can be split into two parts: the central nervous system, which makes up the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which includes the nerves that extend out of the spinal cord and to the rest of the body. We say that neurons transmit electrical signals, but what does that actually mean? Neurons are the longest cells in the human body. Some neurons can even reach lengths of around 1 meter. And like all cells, they contain different parts. The soma, or the cell body, contains the nucleus of the neuron. Short branches, called dendrites, sprout from the soma and are the receiving ends of the neuron for electrical impulses. Meanwhile, the long thread-like structure of the neuron is known as the axon, which makes up over 95% of the volume of the cell. The axon's main purpose is to send the electrical signal down the neuron over to the next one. It is linked to the soma by a conical structure known as the axon hillock. The axon is coated by a layer of fats and proteins known as the myelin sheath, which speeds up the rate of impulse transfer. There are short but periodic gaps in the myelin sheath, known as the nodes of Ranvier, which help speed up the sending of the messages even more. The axon branches out into smaller structures called axon terminals, which are essentially the ending ports of the neuron from which the signal will jump to another neuron. The space between neurons is known as the synapse. Okay, so how do dots form like magic? Neurons are inherently negatively charged compared to their outsides when they are resting. The sodium-potassium pump is the reason for this. By using energy, 3 sodium ions are moved out of the neuron for every 2 potassium ions that are brought in. Think of the pump as an actual pump drawing up water from a well. It needs a lot of effort, but in the end, the bottom of the well will be clear of water. The charge difference, called the membrane potential, is made even greater with the presence of negative proteins. When the neuron needs to send a message, it uses this membrane potential to its advantage. By opening gates called sodium channels along the cell membrane, Na+ ions diffuse back into the neuron. Imagine the pumped up water being poured back into the underground reservoir. This rush of positivity is called an action potential. The positive charge that the sodium ions bring causes unopened sodium channels down the cell to open as well, causing more Na+ ions to diffuse in. This in turn causes more sodium channels to open, and so on down the axon until the axon terminals. At the same time, in response to the action potential, potassium channels open up as well, allowing K+ ions to diffuse out of the cell. Once the signal is passed down to the axon terminals, the neuron returns to its resting state by using the sodium-potassium pumps again to pump Na plus ions out and K plus ions in. Unfortunately, all of this gambling with ions cannot pass a signal down to another neuron. To allow a signal to cross the synapse, neurons use a different strategy. Once the action potential reaches the axon terminals, also called the synaptic terminals, it triggers calcium channels to open. This causes calcium ions to diffuse into the cell. A special family of chemicals called neurotransmitters is responsible for passing messages from one neuron to another. You may know some famous neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin, adrenaline, endorphins, GABA, glutamate, noradrenaline, and acetylcholine. These neurotransmitters are stored in bubbles called vesicles during a neuron's resting state. However, the diffusion of Ca2 plus ions is essentially the wake-up call the neurotransmitters need. The vesicles containing the neurotransmitters fuse with the neuron's membrane, freeing the neurotransmitters into the synapse. Subsequently, the neurotransmitters diffuse across the synapse to the postsynaptic neuron. At the postsynaptic neuron, the neurotransmitters bind to a part of the sodium channel, swinging the gates open to allow Na plus ions to diffuse into the postsynaptic neuron, restarting the cycle and passing the message along. Conclusion. Many people are overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of even the fundamentals of neuroscience, but once you listen to the story of the migrating ions and the water pumps, everything fits together perfectly, reminding us of the quiet beauties hidden underneath, or more precisely, above our noses.